So I just wanted to come back to the material that we've been looking at for this floor, which is, of course, that concrete material. And so I'm going to go to the Manage tab in Revit and then go to Materials and then find that material that I made. And so I'm taking a bit of a risk here because I didn't check by looking at the floor to see what the name of the material was. So I did remember, though, that I called it concrete polish. So all I'm saying there is that if you remember the names of your materials, it will help you a lot. And I'm going to show you in a little while how you can remove a lot of these materials that aren't being used. Because once you're comfortable making materials, it shouldn't be a problem to add new materials as you need them, and then you can comfortably delete all the extra materials, and it's easier to go through this list. So just to remind you, so I didn't select the floor, I just went to Manage, Materials, and again, because I know the name of the material, I can find it in the list there, concrete polished. And so there's the material that we were looking at last week. So graphics, of course, has those things for Revit, but we're looking at rendering here. So on the Appearance tab, we've got all the rendering options, which is also going to tie into what we're about to look at with 3ds maps. So again, the main concept first that I just wanted to emphasise is the idea of these, what I'm going to call maps. In Revit, I don't think that name is going to come up very much. Yeah, when you click on the image there, it's giving you all the things that I'm going to call map settings, and you'll see why I'm calling them that in a minute. But in Revit, I think they're just going to say it's a texture. So there, again, clicking on the image, it brings up the texture editor. If you've got a material that doesn't have an image or doesn't have a map assigned, you can click on that down arrow and choose image to add one, and you can look at these other options. But look, to be honest, those, they're called procedural maps. They're not very useful in any program, really. In theory, they should be useful, and I'm going to explain them more in 3ds Max, but you'll see when I show you them that, and in fact, have I shown you any of these, like the timber one? No. I often don't show people these because they don't look very good, but you know, marble, wood, you can see they're fairly meaningful names. They obviously would be for a marble or a wood texture. They don't work as well as they probably could. So don't worry too much about those. And when I'm looking at textures or maps, I'm generally talking about image maps. And that simply means an image like a JPEG or other formats that are similar like PNG, TIFF, all of those raster formats can be used. And this type is technically called a diffuse map, which essentially means that the material gets its colours from the image, from the photo of concrete. But it's important to realise that there are other kinds of maps. So you can have, say, a transparency map, which controls where your material is transparent. So, for example, if you have stained glass and you want that to be transparent where the glass is and then solid where the lead or leading is around the glass, you can control that with a transparency map. So maybe I'll just put one on in Revit, just so you can see, before I switch over to 3ds Max, that basic concept of a map. And I'll get a map from the P drive. So here in the Material Images folder, I've got a cutout folder. So you can probably tell from this that transparency maps and cutout maps can do similar things. And I'll go to thumbnails. So I'm just going to choose one of these, maybe the square one, because it's easy to understand. So that now is telling my material that where it's black, it should be transparent, and where it's white, it should have the colour. And so I'll actually bring this up, and so that means full transparency. If we go the other way, oops, then yeah, that's better. So now we should be able to see the image. It's probably hard to see, but the concrete image is only going to be where this black and white image has got the white parts. You can see that there. Maybe I'll just change the size so it's easier to see. So that's very small, so I'll make it maybe 3000. So now my squares are much bigger, and you can see there quite clearly. Oh no, it's back to front. That's odd. In Revit. Okay, so that means it's actually the other way around. So it's where it's black, it has the texture, and where it's white, it's transparent. So a cutout map would be the opposite. But just to give you an idea that you can use images to control things like transparency. If you want to remove your image, just click there and you can take it away if you don't want it. Turn transparency off. And so if you think that through, that can be used to control all these different aspects. So reflectivity and cutouts, of course, self-illumination. So you can have your material glow just in certain parts. So if we go there, and yeah, so that. Oh, so maybe stained glass is a good example. So yeah, so that way you can have part of the material see-through and part of it not, and control where it's see-through really precisely. So I'm always thinking of stained glass, but there's, I'm sure, plenty of other examples. I can't think of any. Or even if you've got a like a decal or some sort of logo on a sheet of glass, or a sticker on some glass, right? And so you want the glass to be see-through, but then where it's got the sticker, you want that to be, of course, solid. So you make a transparency map that's that shape, and you do the decal or the sticker, instead of making it with by modelling like you might have in the past, you do it all with the material. It's a really powerful technique. You can do amazing things with it. And so because it's such a useful option to be able to use maps to control all these different parts, you'll see that's a big part of how Revit works. Oh, so how 3ds Maps works. So I want to show you some more about materials. And so I'm going to show you how to get this Revit model into 3ds Maps. And so notice I've already got 3ds Maps open. And I haven't really done much in this file, but if you have and you want to go back to the default settings, on the file menu, you can just choose reset. And that's one for people. If you go to new, it's a bit more complicated, but if you go to, again, file reset, and then I'm not going to save, so I just hit don't save, and then yes to reset. And that just puts it back to the default settings. So then back into Revit, and I'll go to, firstly I'll just save my file to be sure, and then on the file menu, I'm going to show you a couple of different options. So, FBX is probably the most useful one nowadays, but it's not perfect every time, so a lot of people who've been doing this for a long time will still use AutoCAD format, DWG. And for a project like this might actually work pretty well because it's quite simple geometry. But I'm going to use FBX. I'm going to point that one out. So again, File, Export, FBX. So then you need to choose where you're saving this file. So I'm going to save it into my own folder, of course. And yep, that'll do. And so notice, it's using the view name in my file name. So it's got the file name first, so that's Retail 2019, and then it puts the view name at the end. And that's important because you need to use a 3D view as a container to bring it over to 3ds Maps. So I should have pointed that out. You need to be in one of your 3D views to get that FBX option. You won't see it come up if you haven't begun with a 3D view. And it's best to use a camera view. So that's of course what I've got. So I'll click. So I'm going to make a folder just to keep it neat for later. Doesn't matter to start with, but just get some good practices. So I'm going to right click there, go to new folder, and I'll call this Retail retail 3D, something like that. Okay, so I'll click Save, and that creates my FBX file. So that's not very difficult, same as exporting from any program virtually. And then in 3ds Max, on the File menu, you can go to Import, and then you will see there's actually an option to link Revit. And you might have thought, why didn't I just choose that? The reason is, you can tell that actually, if you look at it, it creates an FBX file for you, really. That's what it's doing. So it's basically doing what I just did manually, and because it's an automatic thing, it actually causes more problems doing it this way. So trust me on this one, it's much easier to use link FBX rather than link Revit. So I'll do link FBX, and then go to the folder that I just saved into, and there it is. So there's my FBX file. It's weird. It'll tell you sometimes that it's an AutoCAD FBX. It's not an AutoCAD format, but that's how it is. So anyway, it's the right file. Click Open, and think about the option you use here. I'm actually going to use Combine by Family Type, but those first three options all are useful in different situations. So just have a think about that. But again, I'll do this because we haven't got too many objects, so family type is going to work pretty well. And that's it. So then attach this file, and it will bring the whole model in. So if you thought when I said it uses the view as a container, it still will bring in the whole model. I'll close this, and you can see there, I've got everything that I've made in Revit. So then why did we use the camera? Well, the camera's there as well. And so if you type C on the keyboard, that's the best shortcut to know it first in 3ds Max. C for camera, and that will set the camera view that you've used to export from Revit. So that's it. So now it's already set up for rendering in 3ds Max, pretty much, because if you heard what I was saying earlier, most of the rendering tools that you have in Revit started life in 3ds Max. And that's why I want to use it to show and explain some of the different rendering options, especially materials. So again, if firstly, just to test it and get it working, I'm going to go to the render setup, and that's this teapot with a cog on it. You can also get to that on the rendering menu. You can go to render setup there. So a good thing to test it out is, without changing any settings, just hit render. See what happens. Right, so it's giving us a message about clipping planes there, and that's not important. So we can close the little warning dialog box. So it's working. It's not perfect, but it's working. So that's often the thing that gives people the most trouble when they first bring it in, getting it from this point to into a state where it's rendering with a bit more control. So do you have any idea why it looks the way it does? Why is it so bright looking through the window? What do you think is giving us all that light? Yeah, that's right. That's it, the sun. So you always have a sun in Revit. And in Revit, it's turned on and off through the render settings. So in Revit, you've got in the render dialog box, you've got that option there for artificial only or sun only, or both together. So that's what controls whether the sun is on or off. And also the time, the sun settings can affect it. But technically, even if you go to night time, the sun's still on. It's one of those confusing things. It's just below the horizon, but it's still on, believe it or not. So when you bring it into 3ds Max, the sun is still there, and it's got its own time setting. It's come from Revit, so it's got the same date and time settings. But unlike Revit, in 3ds Max, you can just go and disable that. So I'll do that first. So on the bottom right corner, the very last button in the bottom right is your toggle to switch between that one large viewport and the 4 smaller ones. And that's really important because you'll often want to see those 4 views. And if you've never used the program before, the best way of getting used to navigating in those views, or even any time to switch between the views, right-click. So don't be afraid to right-click anywhere. You can right-click in any of those viewports, and that will make them active. So say if I right-click in the top viewport there, and then I use that same toggle in the bottom right, that will maximise that viewport. So maximise, minimise, the keyboard shortcut is, what is it, Alt-W? Yeah. And so with the top viewport active, again, just by right-clicking, I can zoom with the wheel. So be careful of left-clicking, because a lot of people you will see will left-click to change viewports. And the problem with that is that left-clicking also selects things. So if you've got something selected, say if I select the floor, and then you click into another viewport, it'll deselect it. Right? But if I've got it selected and I right-click, it just changes the viewport and it doesn't affect my selection at all. That's why right-clicking is best for changing viewports. And then again, you can easily navigate. The navigation controls are basically the same as Revit, zooming and panning. The only difference is that Alt is the option key for orbit, not Shift. So Alt to orbit, and the middle mouse button, and that works basically the same as Revit again as well. So you can see as I orbit, there's my sun up above the space. It's obviously not that close to the building. It's, you know, a million miles away. I've forgotten the distance to the sun, but it's a long way, and it is that far technically in this program, but this shows us just the angle. So we can also see it in the top viewport, and so wherever we can see that sun icon, and of course select it. To turn it off, in the modified tab, which is the second one over here, and I'll minimise this just so that it looks the same as what you'll have. Right, so that again, that second tab there, when you select any object, you can almost think of it like properties in Revit. That gives you all the main settings for changing your objects. And so you can see there, there's my sun. It's already turned off. Right, and that's because it's read the settings. So I obviously had in Revit, I had artificial only. So it's picked that up. So then why do we still get the light coming through the window? Okay, it's actually an extra thing that you might not have come across, and it's called Environment Map. And that's actually why I wanted to explain a little bit about maps in Revit first, so you have an idea when you see this. It's also under rendering, and when you go to environment, you'll see there's a map there for the sky. Now, in the past, that would have just been a photo of some sky. And you'll see plenty of those. I've got a bunch of them for you to use on the materials folder on the P drive. So you'll have all these background images that you can set for the sky. And it's great. And so this is what I still use all the time. I often use just plain flat background images. You'll see any pros, if you hear that, will say, oh, why are you doing it that old-fashioned way? There's better ways. But it still looks good, and I still do it quite a bit. So again, thumbnails there. So again, just some more images of, you know, backgrounds with some skies. And that's basically the best way of thinking, or at first, thinking what an environment map is. It's the sky. But again, I can't show you this one because it's a procedural map. In other words, it's a formula that's giving us the look of the sky, and it does look like a sky. It's got a sun and everything. But also, it gives us light. And again, it's one of these technical things you have to think about when you get into high-end rendering. So you've got the sunlight, and that, of course, gives you most of the light during the day. And if you don't have the sun coming through your windows, you're not going to get as much light. But have you ever thought about the other sources of light that you have, especially during the day, but it also applies at night? If you've had to colour in something or render and try and get the effect of the natural lighting, is it all coming from the sun? Yeah, the reflections, but then I mean, it is all coming from the sun in a way, but it doesn't directly come from the sun. So, say if we were trying to colour in and render this room without the lights on, we'd still have light. We don't have any direct sunlight though. So where's the light coming from mostly? Well, what colour is the light during the day? What colour is the natural light generally? What colour tone? Is it warm or cool? Whitish, but there's a tone of white. So it's usually called warm or cool. So at sunrise and sunset, it's warm because it's that reddish tone, because it goes through the atmosphere and it gets that colour. But then during the middle of the day, it's cooler and it's closer to blue. And that's because a lot of the light is actually coming from the sky. So the sky is a really important light source. And that's the main thing. So, and that's how a lot of those programs that you can see give you the realistic lighting. It's because they give you those options to control the skylight as much as the sunlight. So the sun, it gives you most of the light. It's the direct light source that gives us the really bright light. But the sky, because you can see it, that tells you anything you can see is actually a light source. And the sky is actually quite a bright light source. So, again, there is a sky in Revit, but you can't control it. In 3ds Max, you of course have it right here, and you can control it in 3ds Max. So that's where we're getting the light. So it's an extra thing. As well as the sunlight, we've got skylight. Right, so that's what we could say. So, again, just good to understand that. Under rendering, though, to show you again how I got there, it's environment. And to make it simple, I'm going to disable that map. So I'm going to turn that use map option off. And I'll just go and render again so you can see the effect of that. And it's going to go very dark now. Again, we don't care about clipping planes. I'll fix that in a minute. Okay, so it's much darker, but we can still see things because I had the artificial lights in Revit as well, and they've come across. And like anything to do with rendering, the lights in Revit are basically 3ds Max lights. So they work perfectly in 3ds Max, just like lights you've made in 3ds Max. And for spaces like this, I think quite often you don't need to use natural lighting. It's a shopping centre or a shopping mall or something, and you probably won't have a lot of natural light into that corridor, I'm assuming. And so that might be a good setup, just to disable all the natural lighting. So then we can start to look at materials. And so you can see there that the graininess on the floor is a bit too much, but we can use this noise filtering and also bring the render settings up, and that will reduce that. And I'll close this one. See how long that's going to take. 3 minutes, okay, so I won't let it go all the way through, but you should see it a bit better than before. And notice how this is actually, it's what's called a progressive render, so you can stop at any time once you're happy with the quality, and so that's quite common in 3ds Max with ART. You can set the render settings quite high, and then just leave it going up to the point where you're happy with it, which is common with Corona as well. That works in the same way. So you can see now it's going through and it's gradually filtering out a lot of that noise, and it'll get better and better. Yeah, I'm not going to let it finish 4 minutes. I'm not going to wait for that. But just so you can see, so that's pretty much set up for rendering, and I will stop it and yeah. And just show you one other little setting before we get right into materials. So, so coming over to the render setup, so not the render setup, this is actually in the environment settings. So I'll just close that and show you again. So it's under, again, the rendering menu, and you have environment, which I showed you, but then what I want to show you now is exposure control. So when you choose that, it actually brings up the same dialog box. I don't know why they don't just put it all in the same thing on the menu. So those two things, environment, exposure control, effects even, they're all the same dialog box. They're all this one. So at the top, you've got, of course, the map settings for the environment, and then further down, you've got the exposure control where I can do a render preview. Right, so then there's our little render, and using the exposure setting there, you can adjust that, and you can see there as I adjust it, I get some feedback, and so that's just like Revit where you can adjust the exposure. That's a better brightness level, so I'll hit render and it will go through, and sorry, I'm forgetting to do that camera, I'll fix that in a sec. There we are, so that's much better. Okay, so now we're going to have a bit more of a look at materials. So I'll stop that, and then just so I don't get that message coming up with the camera, I'm going to quickly, you don't have to do this, but just want to again not have that error. I'm going to select my camera and then just turn the clipping off. So you've got this clipping plane option, which I'm just disabling, and that should stop that message. Yeah. Might even make it render a bit faster. Yeah. Oh, clipping, so it's just cuts off the render at the front and the back of the camera field of view. So yeah, it can be useful. Okay, but I'll stop that. So yeah, just wanted to test it. Okay, so I'm going to put in some different objects just to put some materials onto them. And so I was on the Modify tab to start with, or to change the settings of those cameras and the what's the other one, the sun. But I'm going to go back to the Create tab to add some new things. And it's fairly intuitive with 3ds Max when you're making these 3D objects. You can do it in a camera view. So I'm going to do that. Right-clicking my camera, and then I'll maximise it. And I'll start with the simplest one, a box. And I'm going to click and drag to create the base of the box. Release, bring it up, click again. So I'll just repeat that, so I'll do another one. Click and drag, release, move it up, and click. Easy. So I'll do some other objects that are similar, like a cylinder. So again, same basic approach. Click and drag to set the base, release, move the cursor up, and click to set the height. Yeah. So pretty intuitive. And maybe just to make something a bit more interesting, I'll do a torus. So a torus is basically a donut. So again, click and drag to set the base. Then when you release, it's setting the radius of the tube. Okay, but notice how this one starts centered on the object in 3D, but it's vertically centered. So I want to move it up, and I'm going to right click and then choose move from the menu that comes up whenever you right click. And that will give us the gizmos that you may have seen in Revit as well with massing. You have the same icon. And I can click and drag to lift that up off the floor. Maybe just go a bit higher. And just like any other object, if you go to the Modify tab, you can adjust all of those properties. You can change the radius of the actual tube itself, or the can't explain it, but yeah, I'm sure you can see. And then the thickness of the tube. That'll do. So the same with any of the others. If I go back to the cylinder, I can change its radius, of course, there. And notice I'm clicking and dragging on the spinner. What's called those arrows. When you click and drag there, that's a really interactive way of adjusting those properties. And then the height, of course, we can do the same thing. And the square or the cubes, boxes, same idea. And one last thing, I'll just make another box. This time I'm going to turn Auto Grid on. So if you want to work like SketchUp does and draw things starting on another surface, that's simple in 3ds Max. Turn that Auto Grid option on, and then you can just make another box starting on the top of the previous one. So I've got a few objects there that I can start to put some materials on. So on the main toolbar, you'll see there's a button for the material editor next to the teapot for rendering. So it's this button here. Now, I'm going to recommend that you go to the simple editor first, the compact editor, because there are two. And the other one is really complicated. That's a node-based editor, and if you've never done node-based work before, don't even attempt it. I'll close that. So that's the one with the wires and the things there that link together. Avoid that and use the one that looks like a dialog box. It is under the menu somewhere. I think you can go to, here we are, Material Editor there. So again, rendering, Material Editor, and then you've got the option for those two different editors. So again, always, especially at first, and even, I've been using 3ds Max since it came out, since it was first released, and so I can use this one, the slate one, pretty well, but still most of the time I use the compact one. That's nothing wrong with that. So again, compact material editor, really important. And you get those nice previews of your materials there straight away. So if you click on the Get Material button, you're actually going to see something very similar to Revit. If you've been looking at the appearance library in Revit, when you scroll down, you're actually going to see exactly the same thing. It's just called the Autodesk Material Library in 3ds Max, but it's the same thing. So, do you remember how to get that in Revit? The appearance library? Sort of? I might just remind you because it's really important. So, okay, so in Revit, it's got different terminology, but again, it is exactly the same. Let's get into it. So, so if you've forgotten, it's on the Appearance tab only. When you right-click and go to Replace, or clicking the button over on the right, that Replace button there does the same thing. So in Revit, it's called your Asset Browser, but again, it does basically the same thing. You've got the Appearance library there. Right, so those folders you can see, ceramic, concrete, default, fabric, finished, flooring, and we go to 3ds Max. They've got a few extra ones, but we've got the same basic main folders, ceramic, concrete, flooring, and so on. And you will see the same material. So if we expand, say, the flooring folder, and then go to, oh no, sorry, no, let's go to concrete actually. Oops, expand that. Okay, so again, to make it confusing, they give them slightly different names, but if you look at this concrete polished, I guarantee you it's going to use the same map as the one in Revit, and where's another one, smooth precast structural. I'll just actually double click and bring it in and make sure it's got the right map that I want. So let's get this new Bitmap thing is so annoying. There we go. Yep. So you can see that's the same image I was using in Revit, if you remember last week. So they are the same materials, even though they sometimes have slightly different names. And so I brought my material in by double-clicking. So again, to get that, if you missed it, I just went Get Material, and I scrolled down to the bottom, right, because all of this up the top is to make brand new materials, and you've got to know a bit more for that. But if you get to the library, you're going to see all of those pre-made materials, which, again, are pretty much the same as the Revit ones. So let's go back to that smooth precast structural because it's got a map that I can show you. Yep. Okay, so there's our new concrete material. I'm going to double click on that sphere so you can see it a bit larger. Right, so you can see it's going on, but what's wrong with it? It's way too small. That's right, it's tiny. So we've got the maps there, but yeah, it looks ridiculous because they're tiny. So I'm going to click on this image slot. So notice that's there where that map goes in for the concrete image. Clicking there, and then you've got a scale. So again, it is just like Revit, but there's one little problem. It's not in millimetres. It's fine, because again, in Max you've got the same options as Revit, so when you go to the Customise menu, you can go to Unit Setup, change it to metric, and I'll set it to millimetres, and OK. And now you can see it's showing me the size in millimetres. And why is the preview? Okay, well, let's just do that. Oh, that's actually the right size. So, yeah. Now watch out for this. It's they're going a bit nutty. Some of the guys who program for 3ds Max now, they make it a bit more technical than it used to be. That is actually the right size. I know it doesn't look the right size on the preview there. It's all to do with this idea of mapping. So when that happens, sometimes it's easier to see it on the objects. So I'm going to select my my cylinder there. To assign a material to an object, one of the easiest ways is just to drag it from here onto that object. So that's assigned. And then, on the Modify tab, I'm going to check to see that this real-world map size option is ticked, and also generate mapping coordinates. We need those two options. And then also, in the material, I'm going to click Show Shaded Material in Viewport. And now I can see that concrete texture on my objects in real time, and I don't have to worry so much about this. That sphere is quite small, that's why it doesn't look right there. So that's going to work, that's going to render at the right size. And I'll just do a quick render so you can see that it is working. Okay, so that's obviously rendering with that texture, so I'll stop that. Okay, so just like Revit, you can control how that map, or the size of that map. So you can see it's 550. That's, I think, too small, so I'm going to make it 1550. And then this one, I'll just do my usual add a 1 to the front, and that's going to be much larger. So I'll just click to the side, and so you should be able to see the change straight away. And you can even do this interactively. And oh no, sorry, it's got its own mapping coordinates. I'll get into this later, but so what I'll show you is on this one. I'm going to show you a simpler material in a minute. If this one looks technical, it's because it was all done in the library, but I'm going to put on this thing called a Uvw Map and set it to cylindrical, just so that I can show you with this option turned off. And so that should let me set the size. There we are. Let's just click to the side and get it. So I'll make that now be a different size. Oh, that's I don't want to change that one. So just the height should be all we need. There we are. So you can see how now, as I adjust that map, the texture changes size. And again, you can see that in real time, but really all I wanted to see there is that mapping, this idea of applying a texture to a surface, can be controlled a lot more precisely in a program like this than in Revit. In Revit, you can control it. You've got settings for the we go back to that concrete one. Right, so you've got settings for the origin, where your texture starts, and for the size. Ignore this option for tiling, right, because it's actually, I think, completely useless. But you'll see in a minute what tiling's all about, and you know, it should be useful, but just because of the way Revit is, it's actually not a useful thing to choose that none option, so always leave that option set to tile. But I want to show you what tiling means. So, but again, the main concept there is that you can control where this image lands on your surface by setting the origin and the size. But that's about all you can control in Revit. In 3ds Max, again, you've got lots more options to control that precisely, and it's important for certain things to be able to control it in that way. So I'll go to this one of these boxes now, and maybe I'll just make that one a bit wider so you can see a simpler texture. That concrete, when it's pre-made, is actually a bit more involved, and I don't want to go too technical, but I'll just get a new material. Right, so this is what's called a physical material, and these actually are built into Revit, even though, again, it won't have that name. They actually are physical materials in Revit, a lot of the things you use. And that just means it gives you a certain group of settings. So you've got a colour there, which is the main colour of the material. So I'll put that onto my object, and you'll see it's grey. And if I click on that colour, it's going to change the colour that we can see on our object straight away. So that sets the colour for the rendering, basically. Don't worry about these others. They're for, you know, reflection and transparency and other things. So that's your main colour setting. So I'm going to click on the button next to it. And then I'm not going to use that awful Autodesk Bitmap, which is what I had on the concrete. I can't stand that, actually. It's really annoying when they use that one. You can tell it's the young 20-year-old programmers they've got who don't know what they're doing. This one's much better. So Bitmap, and so again, I'll just get a texture from the P drive, and let's get something that's easier to see the size, like some bricks maybe. Yeah, maybe actually something with a few less bricks. It should be a bigger one here. Yeah, that'll do. Even though it's bumped, or yeah, that'll do. Okay, so I've got my image, and the nice thing about this this map type, the one that's called Bitmap, unlike the other one, the new one, which is actually worse, it gives you a nice option like this, View Image, so you can see the image without having to switch it on the program. That's nice. Also, you can disable real-world mapping, and that's a brilliant thing. You'll see in a second. So that option there is in Revit always on. You don't have a choice. And without that option to turn this real-world mapping on and off, that idea of tiling doesn't really make sense to me, and that's why I think in Revit it's just a useless thing. And again, I know it's the young guys, and they are young. I've talked to some of these people at Autodesk. They get these guys who are in their 20s, who are brilliant programmers, but don't know how to use the software and how it's really used by people like us. So it's frustrating, but they've left all the old tools in there as well, so you can still go back to using those. So again, when you're looking at materials and you see options like that that are to do with tiling, it relies on you understanding what tiling is. And so I'm just trying to find it, you know, concrete polished. So again, that tile option, again, it doesn't make sense without the ability to work with tiles. And what tiles are, quite simply, are the repeats of your material, of your texture or your map image. So how this brick is repeated. And it's very rarely going to be the case. In fact, I can't think of an instance where I've needed to have that not tiling in Revit. In other words, you always want it to repeat. So I think they just put it in there because they didn't know really what people need in Revit. And in 3ds Max though, you'll see it's a useful option. So I'm simply going to, in this material editor, click on this button, and that should show my brick texture now on this object, because I've assigned the material. But why can't I see it? Well, it's changing, so we can see it, but why doesn't it come up clearly? Exactly, it's the size. And it all comes back to that idea of tiling. So it's because I've turned real-world map size off. And real-world map size, if you want to, that just lets you set a size in millimetres. Right, so real-world size, in other words, using measurements. Turn that off, then it uses tiling. And that's not clear, I'll show you what tiling is in a second. So in the object though, in the box, notice it's also got this option for real-world map size. So we have to disable that too to get that tiling to work. So tiling, instead of using the real-world map size, it sets that image, so whatever you've got in that image of the brickwork, that goes onto each surface. Which is a really powerful approach because it means you can control exactly what goes onto each surface that you're rendering. And this is how all the professional rendering is done. So all of the high-end 3D software, they mainly work this way. And they don't, in many cases, do a different image for each different material. They'll just do a whole wall. So they get they'll actually get the shape of their wall, which is usually a rectangle, which makes it nice and easy, but even if it isn't, you can do this. You get your whole wall, take that into Photoshop, and you paint the whole wall. And that's how they get those beautifully realistic and detailed textures and surfaces onto their walls. They don't try and do it by individual materials, they just paint the whole surface. And then you're working more like an artist as well, so you might know about, you were a map painter, weren't you? Or you did map painting, didn't you? Or map textures? Yeah, so you would have done that sort of work. And yeah. So yeah, that's I think the best way to get realistic textures. And then even for architectural work, they do a lot of facade modelling, or just very simple facades, and then do the whole facade in a Photoshop file, and do a little bit of projection with the bump maps, and that's how they do the outside as well. So, so then if we change the size of the tiles now, so say we want 2 lots of bricks, if we increase that to 2, so notice how it's making it narrower, just in that direction, or we can make it wider by increasing the repeats, or the number of tiles. But with 1 and 1, then again, on each side of that box, we get 1 tile. And that's why I keep saying in Revit, it's a useless option. Why would you ever want it not to have those tiles repeating? I don't know. So, but again, 3ds Max, it makes sense once you've got that tiling option. So, for most building projects though, especially interiors projects, you will be working with materials that have a real size. So it's important to know how to use both those different options. And so I'll just go back and show you a similar thing with, if you missed it, I'm just going to a different material slot there. It's already got a bit of a setup in it. You can see that it's got a colour and a bit of texture. So what I'll do is just click on the Get Material button and come back to the top, and I'll make a new physical material from scratch, just so it's got all the default settings. Okay, so I'm going to put on some another map in a second, but actually I thought I'd better show you the basic properties. So I've been looking at maps a lot, and that's really important. I think it's one of the most important things with any rendering program, to understand how maps work within materials. And again, just think of it with textures if you're not comfortable with that term maps. But then we've got these other basic properties that we'll look at before I put my map on. So we did look at them in Revit a bit. The colour, of course, we've been looking at, and that, again, relies on you understanding how to work with red, green and blue. There's no falling back on CMYK or anything like that. It's all just RGB. But of course, that lets you make any colour. This is full, whatever it is, the trillions of colours, the big colour model. And so you can do any colour you want. It's amazing what colour range you have now in these programs. So red, green and blue to set your colours. And of course, clicking on the colour swatch brings that up. And I really like how in 3ds Max it shows you the colours you'll get. You kind of can learn your complementary colours this way. So when you go and, you've got full red and, full green and full blue. And let's go to full red as well. And you might think, okay, so what happens, green and blue, what does that make? It's obvious when you think about it, but then you can even see here straight away, cyan. Don't be one of those people who thinks red, yellow, blue, the old painting colour model, because it doesn't work. When you're working with accurate colours using light, it's cyan. You know how they tell you red and yellow and blue makes yellow and yellow and blue makes green. Is that something you'll remember from mixing paints? Blue and yellow makes green. It kind of does, but those are not accurate colours. So it's kind of true, but also not. And this is a better way, I think, of learning those things. So again, red and green on 100%. And so then if we take blue down to 0, that's yellow. And then the other one, coming back. So red and blue 100%, and we can see already, even without clicking on it, green at 0 gives us magenta. So I always like to show that because it really does, I think, clear up a lot of confusion about colour models and things, which I think is really confusing if you've grown up being taught that red, yellow and blue are primaries. So it's good to play around with just the colours there, and I really like setting colours in Max just because of that nice colour selector you've got there. So that's one of the basic properties, the colour, which is usually called the diffuse colour in 3ds Max, or in this case the base colour. Then we've got the transparency, which has a colour setting, but you probably shouldn't adjust that generally. What you do there is adjust the value to set how transparent it is. And I'm going to turn the background on, that's just an option over here, so that we can see something behind this preview and make it a bit see-through. And then you've got, unfortunately with these physical materials, some very technical settings to set the reflections. So what I'm going to do is switch over to the, where is it? So we've got to go to standard here. I'm just going to go to a standard material because it's easier to show you these things with a standard material. So with this one, the colour, you can see there is actually called diffuse. And then the specular level is the shininess. And then the opacity is the transparency. Now, transparency in physical materials is not a difficult one, but it's the reflections that will just explode your brain if you're not interested in the physics. It's very technical. So again, it's easy to show you here. When we've got a specular level and a glossiness value that are fairly high, and I'll just bring the opacity up as well. Right, then you can see the highlights. So I'm going to bring that glossiness value up even more, and you can see it's going to give us a much sharper highlight, and I'll bring the specular level up as well, so it's going to give a stronger highlight. So remember in Revit, I had to experiment with those settings quite a lot to get the shininess that I wanted, because you can't really see all of the controls for these settings. You've just got that one glossiness value, and it's not clear how it ties in with your reflections. So yeah, I just wanted to show you here where it's easy. You can basically, because you can see the graph there, and you can see the feedback straight away on the preview. But I'll switch back to the physical material, and then again we'll just change the colour. Whatever. Okay, so with physical materials, it's a bit more involved, and you've got, well, firstly, subsurface scattering is, yeah, don't worry too much about that one. That's going to be difficult to understand, but if I just change it, you'll see it's going to have a bit of an effect. So there are materials that you would know that have this effect. You look at one all the time. Your skin does have this effect built in, but probably at first maybe you can just think of it as almost a shininess. So that does work to control that, and if we take it up to the full value, it's going to give us a fully scattered material. And in a way it's like shininess, but notice how it's giving us this extra layer, so it's not quite the same thing. So I'll put that back to 0. So then coming down, you've got the maps, and that's actually how you control. Oh, and sorry, we'll worry about anisotropy, which is another technical thing. Well, actually, all I want to show you here is that you have the ability to set maps for reflection. And that's, for physical materials, often the best way. But if you just want a shiny material, because I think it best use, well, actually, so I will show you one thing. Roughness is another one you should look at with physical materials, because you're going to get these from Revit quite a lot, and you need to adjust them. So the roughness there is another way that you can reduce that shininess that some of the Revit materials will have when you bring them across. So that's another one you can think of almost like shininess. Unfortunately, they're using the true physics when you're using physical materials, so it can get a bit technical, but yeah, roughness is a good one. Again, if you want to change that shininess value or reflections. Again, I don't want to get too technical. You're going to know something about this, but this is the one that really can confuse people a lot. The IOR, so index of refraction, also affects the shininess, or the way light interacts with the material. So you'll see if I change this, it's going to change that highlight. So have you ever come across the need to set or understand the IOR, or know what the IOR value is for a material? No? There will be cases. So you can see there how it's changed hugely. So the classic example I always think of that you probably all know is diamonds have a different, very different IOR to glass. Index of refraction. So it's the way that light gets bent going through a material. And it might not seem like an important thing, but it actually does make a huge difference to materials, and not just transparent materials. So again, the classic one is diamonds and glass. The reason glass looks different to diamonds is partly the facets, but it's more the refraction. Light refracts very differently, even though they're both transparent materials. It's the refraction that makes diamonds look hard compared to glass. So you don't have to be an expert and know how to work those things out. There are tables you can just search for. It's such a standard thing. Anyone who deals with materials a lot will have to look these things up at some point. So I'll just show you that. And then you can read about it and understand it later. It does actually affect all materials. So there we are. So diamond is quite high. Glass, I think, is around 1 point something, 1.8 or something like that. So that's just from memory. Obviously, you look it up once and then put it into your material and don't have to do it again. Oh, here we go, 1.5 to 1.7. There we are. But diamond, much higher. Water, lower. Again, so water, again, is another transparent material that looks very different to our eyes to glass. And again, it's all to do with that IOR. So you've got those values. IOR there under 1 looks a bit weird, so we'll put that back up. And so that with transparency and roughness, all those things together go to make the reflections. But as you can probably see with physical materials, it can get very technical. The problem is that with Revit, they're trying to make it more of a physically accurate rendering program, so they actually do use physical materials quite a lot, and you've got the physical tab there for that in Revit. Don't want to go too far with that, so if you're finding that is difficult, I use it a bit and I still struggle with it a bit. What I'll often do is change it in 3ds Max. Once I get my Revit material with the basic setup, I'll switch it over here. It's quite easy. Click there to either a standard, or we should have Arc and Design. Why can't I see Arc and Design there? They do have them in ART, I'm pretty sure. Oh no, then maybe just Autodesk Generic. I thought they still had. I'm sure they've got Arc and Design. Come on. Maybe it is all physical now. So I could be wrong. So, yeah, to be honest, I use VA almost exclusively now in 3ds Max, so I'm a bit rusty with some of the old Mentoray related things, but I should have a physical list, just Autodesk Generic, that's very similar. Yeah, let's just do this one. So the other one, Autodesk Generic. So you'll get those from Revit as well. So that's maybe a better one to start with, because you don't have all those physically accurate properties, and it's a much easier thing to understand probably, and you've got to know that physical materials will come up quite a lot when you bring in from Revit, but again with this Autodesk Generic, and that's the one you'll get if you've set, when you go duplicate as generic in Revit. You can see there it says generic, so that is what you'll get in 3ds Max. So a bit simpler, we've got a colour there, set that, and that of course sets the colour of our material. Put the background on. And then you've got the same options to set maps to all of these things. So instead of setting a colour, I can click on that image where it says no map. And to give you a tip there, avoid the Autodesk ones, the ones that say Autodesk in the name. Those maps are harder to use generally. So, we don't even have Autodesk ones, hopefully. Yeah, beautiful. So we've just got the general ones because of, it's Autodesk Generic. So Bitmap is the one you need to use and understand to start with. Just like in Revit, you've got that option there, image, that does the same thing. So again, all of these others, they're using a formula to try and create something like wood, or they don't even put the marble one in here, but they've got wood. Oh no wood anymore. Yeah, there is a wood one in here, but again, they don't look that great. So Bitmap should be the most important one. And so let's get a different sort of image. Let's get some wood and go to there and any of these. Yeah, that'll do. I know, I'll do my old Cedar fence value for everything. Okay, so notice you've got the same options to set the size and everything else. So it's very hard to see when you're using that real world map scale. Sometimes that makes the size hard to understand in this preview here. So turn that off and sometimes it will come up better. There we are. But again, if you're not using it in the material, turn it off in your object as well. So I'll show you there. It's not assigned yet to my box. So I'll drag it from there onto my box. Didn't work, so I'll just try that again. There we are. That's worked. We can't see it there yet because this option needs to be on to see it in the viewport. So that button there, that's your best friend when you're working at this level. It's in this bitmap section. Being able to see it is really important. So there, that toggle. And again, it's showing on my sphere, on my cube, but it's way too small. And it's because I haven't turned the real world map option off in the objects properties. So there I can see it. So that's again going to give me that wood texture. And so that's all in that first panel. These are all to do with the colour. And then what's nice about this is that you have nice simple panels following on from that. So productivity, turn that on. And then we control how shiny it is, of course. So we've got a slider for that. And just like Revit, right? So you've got those two angles, just like we looked at last week. So direct and oblique, hopefully I don't have to explain that. And then again, just like Revit, you've got the glossiness slider. Okay, so, now one thing I didn't explain last week with the glossiness, because I couldn't really show it properly in Revit, glossiness isn't just the shininess. It's how polished things are. So when you've got a low glossiness value, it's just as shiny as it was before. So this reflectivity value, these two values, they determine how reflective this surface is. So the glossiness basically determines how strong or how polished that reflectivity is. In other words, how focused the reflections are. So as I bring this slider up, you're going to see that highlight is going to get brighter because it's more concentrated, and then it goes higher still and it gets smaller because it's more focused and more concentrated, again like it's more polished, and then the reflections are going to be stronger as well. Right, whereas when you go down, it's more of a matte, which doesn't, again, necessarily mean that it's less reflective. It means that the reflections are more distributed. They're not as focused, basically. So that's technically how it works. So again, glossiness and reflectivity do work together. Okay, so there we are. So then again, we've got the option, you can set a map for these as well. And you might be thinking, well, why would I want to have a map for reflections? But you could have part of your surface that's polished and part that's not. And so you can use an image to control that. Transparency, same thing. So I'll just turn that on and you'll see again, it's nice and simple with this simple slider to control how transparent it is. And again, you can use a map for that. So notice how it's might look like a reflection because it's distorting that background, but it's not a reflection. We're seeing through that sphere, and so it's distorting the background, again, using that same IOR value. So here, it's nice actually that they have presets now, so you don't need to go and look up those IOR values. You can just choose. So air is 1, that's our neutral. So that's flat. And we need to have a bit more transparency. Oh, sorry, that's translucency, so I'm doing the wrong one. Sorry, it's early. So you want that, well, that's not going to have any effect really. It shouldn't be, so I'll set that back to, well, you should have the matching. But so it's this one here. Oh, that's right. So the refraction is global. So I'm not thinking. Yeah, refraction's global, but you've got two sliders. You've got one for transparency. Translucency is when you have, translucent glass and things like that, and you do need to bring that up sometimes. But probably hard to see in the preview there. I don't want to wait for it. That looks a bit odd though. Air should be basically flat. Maybe we've got to have more transparency. If we go up higher, then with water, we should start to get, there we are. So that's less distorted than the higher ones, like glass, should be a bit more. There we go. And then diamond, more again. Okay, so I'll put that back to you want a bit higher than, well, actually I don't want transparency, I'm just going to disable that. And I'll just show you some of the other options. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but self-illumination works just like Revit. Bump maps and cutouts, again, just work like Revit. But then you've got a few other brilliant options that you just don't have in Revit at all. And this is one of my favourites. And again, if you're wondering how people get those beautiful photorealistic sort of renders, this is one of the main secrets, as well as doing environment maps, usually with HDR. This is the other trick, ambient occlusion. It's again one of those things that comes from people really looking deeply at the physics of light and how it works in, especially in interiors, but in all of the whole universe. It works the same way. When you have geometry that occludes light, in other words, it blocks the light, it creates these standard effects that you can see in any space. So in the corners of the rooms here, or the bulkhead there especially, you can see that it's darker. Right? So in all of the corners it will be darker, even though at the top here we've got a bit of a painted corner there where it's probably reflecting a bit more light, but generally the corners are darker because less light reaches those corners. And wherever geometry touches, that's going to be the case usually. So, so again, when you see chair legs touching the ground, there'll be little shadows around the legs in addition to the main shadow of the chair leg. You'll get these extra shadows that if you're used to drawing and shading, a lot of you will just draw in naturally when you start shading things. You just put these extra shadows that give your 3D a bit more depth, and you might not have known why, but it's a realistic physical effect. So you have that control to add that ambient occlusion to your surfaces, which it's actually a bit of a cheat because it's not done by calculation in the render. But I'll just show you in some of these where I've really bumped it up beyond realistic, but I think it's a good effect. So here we are. So there, you can see all of these corners. Notice how there's a lot of shading in there. It's not because I've modelled in shadow lines. There's no shadow lines there. Right? They're just surfaces that connect. And I've used the ambient occlusion setting to get that shadow in the corner, which adds a huge amount of depth to the spaces, I think. So all of these, you can see there, all around these corners, and anywhere where surfaces meet. So again, it's an important concept. In any high-end rendering program, they'll have that option for ambient occlusion. And again, it's really important that you can control that at the material level. And I'll put that onto maybe some of the other surfaces as well, but I'll just do that very quickly. So you can see when we render. So it's not on in Revit. And this is why just that fact of bringing models into 3ds Max to render, even though using ART, can give you much better renders because you get these extra options like ambient occlusion. Okay, so it might be a bit of a difficult thing to see, but hopefully you can already see how it's got these extra shadows around the bases of these objects, and they just look a bit more connected to things. To the floor, especially, because the floor is the one I added it to. So only the floor has that effect. But notice again, even on the walls there, you can see it. It's a really nice effect. So it's just that ambient occlusion. There's a couple of other little bonus things I'll just mention quickly, like round corners. So you can put round corners into your material. So it's like filleting, rounding your edges off. In say, AutoCAD, you can round things off in 3D quite easily. But that's modelling. This round corners option actually lets you do it in a material, which is a brilliant thing. But it's a trick. So it doesn't change the geometry and it's not perfect, but if you just want to have it, like say you've done some cabinets and you want that little effect on all of your corners without having to go and model and round off everything manually, that's a nice option to know about. I'll stop that one. So all those extra little options that are brilliant. And again, you don't have to make a new material usually, because the materials that come from Revit are going to be just like your 3ds Max materials. Okay, so all of those are great options. And then just to come back to that physical material, because it can get fairly involved, setting all those physical properties, but you've got to know the physics really to understand how they all work. And I have to go and look it up again when I come back to working with them because I don't use them if I don't have to. Just remember you've got presets, which can make it much easier. And I use these all the time. So it's a bit different to the library. So you've got the library, which you can get to in two ways. You can click on this Get Material, right, and that brings up the map browser, the material and map browser. So that lets you get a material from this browser, which lets you open up libraries and all sorts of things. So there's a whole range of things you can get materials from with 3ds Max, and all of these different ways you can bring materials in, again using Get Material. But that's getting a new material. Right, so Get Material is what I showed you, but then also I've been clicking on this button, which is similar. So that button there gives you the same option, but basically what it will do is change the selected material into the one you choose. Whereas Get Material, the other one on the left, that replaces the material that's selected. It doesn't change it. So what that means in practice, so just imagine if I'll get another one, so let's get there's a glass material, and I'll assign that to my Taurus. And so if I change that, so if I use Get Material and get a completely different material, it doesn't change my Taurus because I assigned the glass to it, and then I got a new material in my editor, and the other material is still there in the background. Right, so I'm going to use this eyedropper now and pick my Taurus, and that'll bring back my glass material. Right, so the eyedropper can be used to pick any surface and get the material, and that's really important when you bring things in from Revit because you can then find out, you know, what the materials are really easily. So, coming back to that glass material, if instead of using Get Material I click on Physical Material, that's the material type, I can change that to a different one, and this is again something you can't do very easily in Revit. But here I can, and so I'll say choose, let's go for this, Autodesk Ceramic. So notice the Taurus has changed. Right, because I'm changing that material, it's still called solid glass, but I changed it to a different one. So to go back, I'd have to click there and go to that physical material that I had before, and again, to save you having to work out all these physical settings. And if you have to work with a physical material, a great way of setting them up is to use those templates, which are different to going to the library. What they are is some preset settings, really to get you started. It's not meant as a library, but it's a nice thing because, again, I obviously forget what half of these technical physical settings mean and have to think about it. But if you go and say, I want rough concrete, it's going to give you a pretty good basic setup to start with that. Give it a second. Oh, sorry, that's not my preview. Let's get that preview for the concrete. Right, so that's all done. And if I don't like that, I can still go back to my glass, just going into the list there, and there's the glass that it had solid geometry. And it will be as it was before, and I don't need to be a physical material expert and work out all these IOR settings and things like that. So that's helped me a lot. It's a shame they've taken, I'm really annoyed actually, they've taken Arc and Design out completely, which is a bit sad because Arc and Design was architecture and design material, which was basically an easier version of this physical material. They've obviously taken it out though, so that's very sad. But yeah, don't worry about that. If you use Autodesk Generic, it will easily do what you need. And but again, physical materials with the templates are also pretty good. Hot dog bun. Let's see what the oven's in that one for. Oh yeah, probably pretty good. Right, so some amazing stuff in there. Let's go back. The timber one's pretty good. The wood. Where is it? Can't see it, but it is there. I'm sure they haven't taken wood out. There it is. Satin and glossy wood. So again, they're just a starting point. So if you don't want that wood texture, once you understand maps, remember it's this slot next to the colour, the one that says M, will take you to the Diffuse Map. And then again, notice C, even though it's Autodesk, they use the Bitmap one, not the new Autodesk Bitmap. That tells you something. So if you click here and you can choose a different image. So I won't do that, but well, actually I will. I'll change the bar just so you can see something different. There we go. So yeah, so you don't need to know what every single setting means, as long as you know how to get to the important ones, and have a bit of an understanding of that idea of maps, controlling lots of things, but at first probably the colour is still going to be the most important one. And then those other main properties of shininess or reflectivity and transparency, the main ones. And, yes, of course. Yeah, that's it. That's all I wanted to do. Yeah, I know it's a lot to take in. I know. It's a lot to take in. Look, and when I first started doing this back in the 90s, when no one knew about this stuff, yeah, it was even worse. So I know what it's like. Yeah, so that's it. That's all I'll do. But again, good to understand those things. If you want to try out those steps, it's a good thing to experiment with. And if you can get your model linked into 3ds Max, you can play around with those things. And I will just show you one last thing. If you have it linked from, it is linked, that's what I want to make clear. So if you've done it, go through the steps of bringing it from Revit into 3ds Max, and then you make some changes to your Revit model. I'll just do something very simple. To bring those changes across, you just go back and export your FBX file again. Make sure you're saving in the same place and just save over the file you've exported previously. Then go back into 3ds Max, go to the File menu, and then go to Reference, and then Manage Links. Go to the Files tab, and Reload. Okay, so I'm just going to tick these two options because I want to keep the work I've done to the materials in 3ds Max, and I'm also going to turn the cameras and the lights options off because I brought them in previously as well. But that's it. I'll click OK, and you can see it's brought that change in, and that'll work for anything. So that's a really good way of being able to then, keep doing what you want to in Revit, but then start experimenting with, maybe 3ds Max as well. Oh, well, you can. So say, look, so it's a different process. So normally people would think about doing that if they've done maybe sort of prototyping and modelling at the beginning of their design process for conceptual development, and you're doing geometry mostly. So you can definitely export all of that geometry as a 3D model, and you can get it back into Revit. But it's not the normal workflow when you're thinking about rendering. So, and it's a problem though, because I know what you mean. You might be doing like a really complex thing that you've made in 3ds Max and added to your Revit model, and then you want to have that show up in your plans in Revit, and there's no simple way of having it linked back the other way. You would have to you can get the geometry, so you can get those complex things to show in Revit, but it's not a simple thing like it is to go from Revit to 3ds Max.
So, if
yeah. 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 Well, so I know what you're saying, yeah, so that's right. So, yeah, if you've done your work in Revit and then you've added more and made some changes in 3ds Max, you just got to think about what you're doing, and maybe, especially for main design decisions or main design elements, do as much of that as you can in Revit. So it's normally just going to be for parts where you're adding detail or modelling. It will be adding detail and doing things that you don't need to see in Revit. But say you had added something that, that wasn't in Revit at all, like a new object or something like that, you've got to think about how you're going to show that on your plans. And the normal approach is to do a simplified version. So you might say it's a complex sculpture or something like that. You'll then get that out of 3ds Max back into maybe even AutoCAD, and then just do an outline of it and bring that in so that you can have a shape that shows on your plan in Revit where that sculpture is. but you're not going to see, and you probably wouldn't want to see that full complex 3D model in Revit anyway. But yeah, you do have to plan out the approach if you're going to do modelling in 3ds Max that isn't in Revit. Yeah. So materials. So yeah. Oh yeah. No, there's no eyedrop at all in Revit really. Oh, the materials. Oh yeah. Okay. So you've got a choice. So the materials will always come from Revit until you choose that option that I just showed you that will keep the 3ds Max materials. So when you're relinking the file, you've got a choice. You can tick that option and then it won't overwrite changes that you've made to the materials in 3ds Max. So yeah, so anything you've only done in Revit, if you haven't changed it in 3ds Max, it will bring that in from Revit. But once you tick that option, it'll pick up the things that you've changed in 3ds Max and it won't change those things. But it's a one-way workflow, so it's basically from Revit to 3ds Max and it's not going to go back. Materials and things like that, you generally wouldn't take them back to Revit. Yeah. Does that make sense? Yes, of course. Yeah, have a break. Yeah.